At the time of this recording, we're 6 episodes into Invincible Season 3, and so far, the season's been really good. But that's not without its drawbacks. I think there's one really big issue that's plaguing Season 3 and holding it back from being truly spectacular. So I want to take some time to look at this issue and the season as a whole so far, and what this means for the show moving forward. Because this is not an issue that's unique to Season 3. In fact, it started back towards the end of last season. But I think this is just a result of how the show is being written and derived from the comics. Now, though I'll be focusing on mainly the negative aspect of this season, I do really like the season as a whole and a lot of the stuff they're doing with the characters. I think each of the individual stories they've presented are really well written and executed, and the overall themes and questions that the season proposes are very interesting to explore. But getting back to the topic at hand, I think the biggest issue of Season 3 is the lack of focus and pacing. Now, what do I mean by that? As I've been watching through the season, it just feels like I'm watching a collection of independent stories, rather than an entire season with an overarching narrative. We've gotten some incredible stories throughout these 6 episodes, but now it feels like we're at a point in the season where the writers realize that they only have 2 episodes left to wrap this thing up, so they've brought Angstrom back as the big bad. And yes, I know they've had him throughout the entire season spying on the Grayson family, but he really hasn't had enough on-screen presence to make him feel like the final boss of the season. And I think this is the same issue that faced Season 2. We only saw Angstrom mainly in episode 1 and episode 7 and 8, and he really felt underdeveloped as the big bad of the season. This lack of personal connection being built up throughout the season really makes the stakes a lot lower, and it doesn't make it as personal for the audience. All we've seen of Angstrom is through post-credit scenes in the season, and that's not nearly enough to build a strong connection with our hero to justify being the finale of the season. Now, yes, the finale is Invincible War, and hopefully they do something great in episodes 7 and 8 to make it feel satisfying. But this feels like a repeat of Season 2, where the big bad was only brought in at the very end of the show rather than developing through the entire season. If you compare this back to Season 1, the story is a lot more focused, and the final battle between Invincible and Omni-Man is built up throughout the entire season. Versus right now in Season 2 and Season 3, the final battle between Mark and Angstrom, and now Mark and the other Invincibles, hasn't really been built up to the same degree. So, to me, it doesn't make it seem as personal and as satisfying of a conclusion. And this is what made the ending of Season 2 really jarring for me. The beginning of the season was really focused on how Mark's family and everyone else was dealing with the incident in Chicago. But by the time we got to episode 7, it didn't really feel like we had a finale built up. It just felt like, okay, let's have Angstrom return now to fight Invincible and threaten Mark's family so he can go through his development that he needs. Because if you remember, from Mark's perspective, he'd only run into Angstrom once before throughout the entire season. There was no chemistry or relationship or conflict developed between the two throughout the season. Whereas Season 1, where the conflict between Debbie and Omni-Man and the relationship between Omni-Man and Mark is developed through the entire season. Prior to the finale, Mark and Angstrom had only ever interacted once before, and that was at the beginning of the season. And in Season 3, they haven't even come face to face yet. So it's going to be very difficult to write a conclusion that feels satisfying and neatly wraps up the entire season. And as a side note, Angstrom not dying after we saw him turn into a pool of blood from the last finale, I think is really dumb and takes away from a lot of the development that Mark went through after that. Because a lot of this season has been Mark wrestling with the fact that he lost control and killed the dude, which is why he'd become so disciplinary towards Oliver and hard on himself throughout the entire season. But realizing that Angstrom is still alive, I don't know how that's going to play out. We'll still have to see. But to me, that took away a lot from that finale. Now, talking about the pacing issues. The season began jumping straight into the action, and the first few episodes were really fast paced. They were also pretty focused in setting up the entire season and the big conflict between Mark and Cecil. But it didn't really feel like any of these events got some time to breathe, and I think that's really what the show needs more of. Episodes 5 and 6 were great at doing that, and their stories were amazing, but I still think that they felt a little bit filler because they didn't relate back to the main overarching themes of the season. I think the Mark and Cecil conflict was introduced a little too soon, and the last time we had any developments in it was in episode 3. 3 more episodes have come out since then, and nothing has progressed in that storyline. I think that conflict should have been introduced maybe in episode 2 or even episode 3, and it should have stayed relevant throughout the rest of the episodes in the season. Episodes 4, 5, and 6 could have benefited from having some sort of connection back to Mark and Cecil's conflict, which would have made them feel more integrated and actually a part of the main storyline of the season. I also think the Mark and Eve relationship was moving way too quickly, and even though they mentioned it in episode 5, I still don't feel like that fully justifies everything, because up until that point, they were still moving at lightning pace. Even though there's been a time skip since season 2, and in universe we're about 3 months from the events of season 2, because from the audience's perspective, Mark and Amber just broke up at the end of episode 7, and it hadn't even been 2 full episodes of story time since that relationship ended. And having Mark and Eve jump into it right away, it doesn't really feel like it got the time it needed to develop properly. And even right now, though they've had 6 episodes together, and just something about their connection just still doesn't feel very natural in my opinion. Another thing is, I think the side stories have taken up a little too much of the runtime for the season. You gotta remember, we only have 8 episodes in the season, and when all of episode 5, 6, and even the first half of episode 4, so effectively 2.5 out of 8 episodes being dedicated to side missions that don't really progress the main plot at all, feels like we're wasting our time and make it really feel insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Now, don't get me wrong, all the side stories that we've gotten this season have been really good. Each one of them, if you look at them on their own, have been excellent. But it's hard to see where they fit into the overarching story, especially when there is minimal connection back to the main themes. I understand that we want to expand the world and explore all these other stories and characters in the show, and I'm all for it because all the characters in the show I think are great. But when we only have 8 hours for the entire season, I think we have to be a little pragmatic and make some choices here. Either we make these stories more concise, or we have to increase the season runtime. One of the best things about the show, though, is that it takes the time to explore these other stories and flesh out every single character that introduces. And I think this is really what separates Invincible from other superhero media out there. Now, looking at Invincible as a whole so far, ever since the end of season 1, from what I've seen in comment sections and people who have read the comics, feels like the plot lines we're seeing are very closely tied to the order they're presented in the comics, but I think we're falling a little too closely in a way that doesn't really work in a show where we only have 8 hours of runtime. So my proposal, even though I don't think is realistic, would be increasing the runtime of the show. If each season had more than 8 episodes, I think that would solve a lot of the issues that I feel are plaguing Invincible at the moment. We get enough time that we could properly flesh out all these side characters without making it feel like it's taking up too much of the whole season's runtime. And we'd still have enough time that we could hit all the major plot points that we want to and give each story more time to breathe without being forced to jump right into the next main story. So yeah, in conclusion, increase the runtime. But realistically, I don't think that's going to happen, and especially with most modern shows only being 8 episodes per season, and Amazon wanting to push out a new season of this show every year, there's no way I realistically see the runtime being increased. But hey, one can speculate, right? But yeah, let me know what you guys think in the comments, whether you agree or disagree with me, and I just want to hear your general thoughts with the season so far. Anyways, thanks so much for watching.